Hi all, it's Mrs. Hale coming back at you guys with Period 3 content. So Period 3 is kind of massive that I'm going to divide this time into 3 different sections. My first section is going to be like the French and Indian War through the colonial taxes, and then the Revolutionary War, and then War in New Country, and now what? So Period 3 technically covers the years 1754 to 1800. Just to give you some idea of what's going on in America or the American colonies at this time, let's talk about general characteristics. So keep in mind that the American colonies have become blended with German immigrants, Scotch-Irish immigrants, French, English, that type of idea. And we're starting to adapt into our own culture and national identity. Most of the colonies did have some sort of self-government, namely, of course, if you are white, male, and owned some sort of property. And there were varying degrees of religious toleration throughout the colonies. And the idea for people coming to the colonies is that there was some hope of social mobility, that you weren't stuck in the aristocracy of Europe, that you did have a semblance of free speech and freedom of the press, namely from like John Peter Zenger in 1735. Also, realize the economics of the time. By 1760s, half of England's world trade actually was coming from the American colonies because we had the riches that they wanted, namely like a lot of the raw materials, if you will. Also, there was the idea of mercantilism, which is that government regulated trade and production, basically with the intent and purpose to enrich the colonial parents, in this case, England. Now, also keep in mind, because I'll reference this in a little bit here, that we have something called the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts were in the 1600s, like 1650 to 1673, and kind of felt their influence later on as well. And the idea was that the English and colonial ships would always go to and from colonial ports, or English ports specifically. It was relatively lax in enforcement at first. The good was that it actually helped New England shipbuilding and the Chesapeake tobacco monopoly that they had on it, and England provided military protection for these items. However, because of the Navigation Acts, because of mercantilism, a lot of the colonial manufacturing was limited, and you have the low prices for crops, and the colonists therefore had to pay higher prices because they had to import the manufactured products. So where this brings us to is going to be in the beginning of 1754 and the French and Indian War. So the French and Indian War was actually a series of wars that had spilled over from Europe. Now, this is also known as the 7 Years' War. And this takes place 1754 to 1763. Now, in Europe, I had mentioned there had been fighting between the French and the English, and it had been a series of wars. King William's War, Queen Anne's War, the War for Jenkins' Ear, and then it secondarily spilled over into the Americas because you have the French that had been colonizing here for trapping and trading, and then, of course, the English with more permanent settlements. So, from like going through the actual war and the reasons behind it and some of the early losses, stuff like that, you have, from the British perspective, POV is point of view, okay? So from the British point of view, the French had attacked forts in the Ohio River Valley area, and ORV, Ohio River Valley, and it was in order to stop British expansion. Now, keep in mind the 13 colonies all along the Atlantic coastline, but more inland, were the French because of their trading, their trapping, their relations, needing the access to Mississippi River to move their products and stuff, right? So from the British perspective, the French had actually attacked the British forts in the Ohio River Valley to try to stop British expansion. And there had been some early fighting going on at like Fort Duquesne in Pittsburgh and then Fort Necessity as well in Pennsylvania. Now, as far as the war goes, right? So the war actually started off pretty poorly for the British. And for example, in 1755, General William Braddock for the British lost at Fort Duquesne. Duquesne is one of those weird words that is French, and I only remember how to spell it by calling it Duquesne. But so when General Braddock lost at Fort Duquesne, which is in Pittsburgh, in modern day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then the British tried to invade Canada in several times, 1756 to 1757. It was always a failure, okay, for the British. Now, what they realized, though, was that they needed some sort of coordinated colonial defense. So the coordinated colonial defense was in Albany, New York. And and this is in 1754. So the details of it are that 7 colonies actually agreed with Benjamin Franklin's idea for an intercolonial government and a system for recruiting troops and collecting taxes for common defense. Now, I'll say common reasons. So taxes, troops, and some sort of like government system, if you will. Now, these 7 colonies that got together and sent delegates, they agreed with these ideas like from Benjamin Franklin and that they needed some sort of coordinated defense, but the biggest problem was taxation. So it never actually took effect. Now, the Albany Plan of Union didn't take effect, but there was significance behind it. So the significance behind it is the precedent for future work together or togetherness. So although it may have failed at the time, right, it at least had a good positive lasting effect. Now eventually, through some luck, through some good military tactics, the war began to turn and tide for the British. And so ultimately it was a British victory. And the British ended up taking places like Quebec and Montreal from the French. So what ultimately ended the treaty, or the French and Indian War, was the Treaty of Paris. And this is the one in 1763. And what it specified was that Great Britain would get French Canada and Spanish Florida. And in exchange, because the French lost, and the French, essentially lost Spanish Florida for them, the French then gave Spain Louisiana, Westward Territory, and the Mississippi River as compensation for losing Florida. The effects of the war are that the British superiority. So the British superiority now reigned in North America, and then also they proved their naval power and their naval might. Then also the colonists, interestingly enough, were proud of their military and the fight that they had put up, because they also realized a bit how ridiculous it was that the British redcoats were fighting in the wilderness and their tactics weren't working, but it was really like the colonists and their backcountry tactics that worked in the war. Now, with the British weren't so proud of them, but the colonists kind of held on to that idea. And one of the big effects from this, though, besides like the colonists being proud and British superiority, is that the British changed their colonial policies. And, excuse me. And so with that, they had no more salutary neglect. Now, salutary neglect was almost like that purposeful, I'm ignoring you. It's like, I know what you're doing, but I'm ignoring you. And a lot of it was because of the cost of the war, and the British Parliament felt that the colonists needed help pay for their part since fighting took place on their land as well. Now, some more lasting things that came out from this war, besides like the basics just between the British and the French, is going to be due to Pontiac's rebellion. So Pontiac's rebellion was, Chief Pontiac led a group of Native Americans and attacked different colonial settlements on the western frontier, all the way from New York down to Virginia. And because of Pontiac's rebellion that occurs, you then have the Proclamation of 1763. And the Proclamation of 1763 said that British colonists could not go west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the reason was because the British could not protect them against like the Native Americans that were over there. Now the colonists reacted to that with anger and defiance and basically said, you're not stopping us. We fought for this land that we got from the French. We're going to go continue. So that kind of concludes and brings us through 1763, the first part of period 3. So keep in mind, I had mentioned that there was no more salutary neglect, and the British government ended up placing a series of acts and taxes on the colonies as a means of trying to protect the colonies, but then also requiring that they pay for their share of protection. Of course, the colonists bristled against this and basically saw this as threatening their liberties and their form of representative government. So what I wanted to go through were the early acts and the lead up to the Revolutionary War. So to start with, you have the Sugar Act, which is also known as the Revenue Act. And this is in 1764. And what it was a tax on foreign sugar and luxury imports. Now, the important point of this was to raise money, okay, and to stop smuggling. And this we start to see actually enforcing the Navigation Acts from long before, and I just mentioned that in the beginning of the video. The Navigation Acts were the ones that required all trade, imports, exports to go through a British port, right? And the colonists were getting around it by smuggling. And so now they're saying, no more. We are raising money. We are paying, for your protection, and we're going to enforce the Navigation Acts. You then also see early on the first version of the Quartering Act. And the Quartering Act was that the different colonial regions had to provide food and housing for soldiers. Now, this first one was not immediately placing the soldiers in people's homes, but rather in their communities. So then you have the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act was your tax on legal documents, your all sorts of, print, that type of idea, right? What makes this tax so important is that it is the first direct tax on colonists. Now, this wasn't the first tax that they had paid, but like most of the other taxes that had been enforced before, put in place, were actually paid by the merchants, and then the cost was more so passed down to the colonists, right? But this was the first direct one that immediately the colonists saw the impact of. So, of course, this leads to a series of early protests. And this is where we get the idea of no taxation without representation. Because the colonists felt like, hey, we're not represented directly in Parliament. Like, you can't tax us without our permission. And yet the argument coming back from Parliament in London was saying, we virtually represent all of our colonies. So the protests were no taxation without representation. And in 1765, the Stamp Act Congress was formed. And the Stamp Act Congress said that basically only the colonial assemblies had the right and authority to approve taxes. The Stamp Act Congress was more the relatively peaceful way of doing things, but then you also start to see the Sons and Daughters of Liberty emerge. And keep in mind, the Sons and Daughters of Liberty took more of a violent action. The Daughters of Liberty were the ones that led a lot of the home front boycotts going on, particularly of imported products. And it proved to end up being so effective to boycott imports that the London merchants actually cried out to Parliament saying, we've lost money, we have this decrease in trade, it's hurting us financially, and so eventually the Stamp Act was repealed. So then other acts prior to the war, you have the Declaratory Act, and the Declaratory Act stated that Parliament had the right to tax and make laws for the colonists, or colonies, I should say, in all cases whatsoever. So basically saying, guess what? Your idea from the Stamp Act Congress, the no taxation without representation, guess what we're saying? Yeah, we have your right. So then this leads to the Townshend Acts. And the Townshend Acts are the ones that were placed like on tea, paper, glass, lead, that type of stuff. And there's all sorts of imports. And the money went to pay. What's interesting about this is that the money actually went to pay for the British officials that were in the colonies. Now, prior to the Townshend Acts, the individual colonies and colonial assemblies paid for the British officials, which meant that there was some sort of mutual working relationship, if you will, between then the British officials and the colonial legislature, because they were like, hey, we pay your salary, right? Well, now the British are taking away that right, and the British officials are getting paid by the crown. And so now the colonists are like, well, we have no say, we have no one really on our side, and that type of idea. Also, part of the Townshend Acts was that the British officials could search private homes. And that would also be private ships, for example, because they were looking for smuggled goods. And they would only need what's called a writ of assistance instead of your typical search warrant. And a search warrant, like we know today, like your official judge gives a document to say, yes, you can go into my property and search for this. But basically it gave a blanket statement to the British officials to say, yeah, you can go into private homes, private locations, and search for the smuggled goods. Now, also, the Townshend Acts suspended New York Assembly because they had defied the Quartering Act. And eventually, the Townshend Acts were repealed because it hurt trade and actually generated very little revenue, so there wasn't really much of a point to it. And building off of this is then the event of the Boston Massacre. Now, the Boston Massacre, remember, this is March of 1770, and 5 people were killed, including Crispus Attucks, who had been an African. And keep in mind that John Adams actually represented the British soldiers, giving them a fair trial and actually got them all acquitted. His cousin, Samuel Adams, though, is the one that labeled this a massacre. And then you also have the infamous image, the engraving by Paul Revere. And so in class we had talked about like what defines really a massacre, but you can use this as propaganda then. So as right, sorry guys. As time continues on, there had been a little bit of a lull in the early 1770s, but then you have a group of people called the Committees of Correspondence, and they were from 1772 to 1773, and their purpose was to exchange info regularly between the colonies, to find out what was going on in the different colonial regions, to find out how the colonists were reacting, to find out what the British were doing, that type of thing, and basically just to have that correspondence, that sense of organization between the different colonies. And then you have the Gaspee incident, and this is in Rhode Island, and the Gaspee was a ship, and it was a British customs ship, which means that they sat in the port and basically would stop ships, check them, collect taxes, but also check them for smuggled goods. And they were actually pretty effective at catching smugglers. So what ended up happening was, off the coast of Rhode Island, the Gaspee actually ran aground, and the colonists took advantage and set the ship on fire. So then, as we see more and more like violence, if you will, pop up, we also have the Boston Tea Party. And the Boston Tea Party was in 1773, and this was 342 chests of tea that had been dumped into the harbor. Now, a little bit of background to this. Why were the colonists so angry? So the British had been supplying tea from a company called the British East India Company. And the British East India Company was going bankrupt. And so Parliament, because a lot of the members of Parliament actually had investments with the company, wanted to help bail them out, and devised a series of taxes and pricing that would entice the colonists to buy their tea. Now, nature of the beast, the tea was still cheaper than what they could get from like the Dutch company, but as a matter of principle, the colonists actually boycotted all tea. And in 1773, when a huge shipment of tea came in from the British East India Company, your Sons of Liberty, dressed as like Indians in the night, stole onto the ship and dumped all the tea into the harbor. So then, in reaction to a lot of what Boston had done, you then have the Intolerable Acts. And the Intolerable Acts were actually a series of different acts, including coercive, and then a new Quebec Act as well. So the Coercive Act was in 1774, and it was basically targeting a lot of Massachusetts and Boston because of the Boston Massacre, because of the Boston Tea Party. It seemed to be the hotbed area. So in the Coercive Act, the Boston ports were closed. Any crimes tried, which may have normally been tried in the colonies, were now tried in England. And then they also had a new enforcement of the Quartering Act, and this is the one that actually put soldiers into private homes. Then you also have, as part of the Intolerable Acts, one with the Quebec Act. And the Quebec Act infuriated the colonists because it extended Quebec's boundary into the Ohio River Valley area. And the colonists are like, time out, we just fought the French and Indian War. We kicked out the French, that was supposed to be our land, and now you're giving that land to the French Canadians? Like, how is this okay? Also, you have the official religion of Quebec is going to be accepted as Roman Catholic. And once again, the colonists are like, time out, we fled from England, some of us, because of religious persecution, and now you're giving like the people of Quebec their own official religion. And so when you add all these, different acts and taxes and colonial like sentiment of their sense that they were losing their freedom of press, their freedom of religion, their freedom of the right to assemble, their self-governments and stuff like that, you get to the boiling point of actually going to war. So this was the first part of period 3, and that basically takes you from 1754 to mid-1770s. And in my next part, I'll talk about the Revolutionary War.